In the western reaches of Pleiku province, close enough to Cambodia that a wrong turn on a map could start an international incident, the 4th Infantry Division spent the early months of 1967 hunting an enemy that did not want to be found. Operation Sam Houston was supposed to be a controlled affair, a spoiling campaign to keep the North Vietnamese off balance before they could mass for the offensive everyone expected. Instead, it became a lesson in how quickly a routine mission could turn into a catastrophe. On the morning of March 22nd, 2 rifle companies from the 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry walked into the jungle south of the Plei Doc Valley to find a handful of missing men. What they found was a prepared enemy battalion, waiting. Within minutes, the lead platoons had been shredded. The story of how that unit ended up there, and what happened once it did, says a great deal about the war in the Central Highlands. The 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry belonged to Colonel James Adamson's 2nd Brigade, one of the 2 maneuver brigades the 4th Infantry Division fielded in the Highlands during the dry season of 1967. The battalion was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Harold Lee, a professional officer running a straight-leg infantry outfit in some of the most punishing terrain the American Army encountered anywhere in Vietnam. His companies were the standard building blocks of the period, roughly 100 to 130 men apiece when at full strength, though attrition and illness meant they rarely were. 2 of those companies would carry the weight of March 22nd. Company A was led by Captain William Sands, a Citadel graduate with a reputation for hardness and precision. Company B was under Captain Robert Sholly, an officer who would later write about these events in detail. Holding the whole enterprise together at the small unit level were the non-commissioned officers, the platoon sergeants and squad leaders, who translated orders into movement through terrain that swallowed radio signals and sightlines alike. Among them was First Sergeant David McNerney of Company A, a career soldier on his 3rd tour in Vietnam. The kind of man a company leans on without quite realizing how much until the moment it has to. The battalion's rifle companies were organized around 4 platoons apiece during this period, a heavier structure than the 3-platoon norm, which gave a company commander more combat power forward, but also more men to control across ground that resisted control at every turn. Each platoon carried its own M60 machine guns, the belt-fed weapons that anchored a unit's firepower in close terrain, and a rifleman carried the M16, still relatively new to the force and still accumulating its reputation, for better and worse, in the humidity and grit of the Highlands. A company on the move in the Plei Doc was not a formation so much as a long, thin thread of men picking their way through vegetation in near single file, where the brush demanded it, spreading only where a clearing allowed. That thread was strongest at its head and most vulnerable there as well, because the lead platoons were the ones that would trigger any ambush and absorb its opening burst. Operation Sam Houston grew out of a simple proposition. The 4th Infantry Division would conduct offensive sweep operations in the Plei Doc Valley, in southwestern Pleiku province, to locate and destroy B-3 front forces and deny the enemy a base there. The field force commander had a standing warning. If you let the enemy get set, you would pay hell getting him out. And the enemy in the valley was a known quantity, several Pavan regiments that fought the same way each time, short savage attacks before withdrawing across the Cambodian border where the Americans could not follow. Bunker complexes were known along the valley floor. Sam Houston was the answer. Constant pressure meant to disrupt those preparations before they matured into an offensive. The intelligence picture that shaped the operation was a mixture of solid indicators and educated guesswork. Aerial sightings, long-range reconnaissance patrols, and communications intercepts had all pointed to a growing North Vietnamese presence in the Plei Doc by February. The division's earlier commander had warned that the enemy was building a fortified redoubt in the valley, and while the incoming leadership found little to confirm that at first, the signs accumulated. What American commanders knew was that the enemy was there in force. What they could not reliably know was exactly where, in exactly what strength, or with exactly what intentions. This uncertainty is worth holding on to, because it is the difference between the mission as it was understood and the mission as it actually unfolded. The operational plan reflected the terrain and the intelligence in equal measure. Responding first with B-52 strikes against suspected concentrations, the division positioned Adamson's 2nd Brigade between the Plei Trap and Pleiku City and pushed 2 of its battalions across the Nam Sathe River on February 12th to make contact. As the fighting developed west of the river, a 2nd Brigade was brought in to take responsibility for the ground between the 2 rivers, freeing the 2nd Brigade to keep working westward toward the Cambodian border. The concept was straightforward enough on paper. Find the enemy, fix him in place, and bring the full weight of American firepower down on him before he could slip back across a border the Americans were forbidden to follow him over. By the middle of March, the operation had shifted its focus. The 2nd Brigade moved south into the Plei Doc, a heavily jungled area abutting the Cambodian border below the Plei Trap. The reasoning was sound. Enemy activity had been detected there, and the brigade followed it. Yet this shift also stretched the same tired units into new and unfamiliar ground, and it is here that the chain of events tightens toward disaster. There is a recurring quality to operations of this kind, in which each reasonable decision narrows the options available for the next one, until a unit finds itself committed to a course that no single person ever quite chose. The immediate trigger was a lost patrol. Late on March 21st, the 2nd Brigade lost radio contact with a long-range reconnaissance patrol operating near the Cambodian border in the Plei Doc. These small teams, 6 men at a time, were the eyes of the brigade. They moved quietly and deep, watching trails and reporting movement, deliberately avoiding contact because their value lay in observation rather than combat. A patrol of that size had no capacity to fight a sustained action. If it was compromised, its options were to break contact and evade or to call for help, and its survival often came down to how quickly a larger force could reach it. Losing radio contact with such a team was therefore serious on 2 counts. There were the men themselves, 6 soldiers somewhere in enemy country, with no way to report their situation. And there was the meaning of the silence, which could indicate anything from a failed radio to an overrun position. The brigade had to assume the worst and act on the assumption that the men might still be alive and reachable. Colonel Adamson ordered Lieutenant Colonel Lee's battalion to find them. Here the logic of the rescue began to work against the rescuers. A missing patrol near the border, in ground the enemy was known to occupy, was exactly the kind of bait a prepared force could use to draw a larger unit onto chosen terrain. Whether the North Vietnamese engineered it deliberately or simply exploited an opportunity, the effect was the same. The requirement to move fast, to reach the men before it was too late, pushed against the caution that the terrain and the situation would otherwise have demanded. Lee, recognizing the urgency, dispatched 2 companies the following morning. Speed was the priority. It would also be the vulnerability. At first light on March 22nd, the 2 companies moved out. Captain Sands took Company A west-southwest along a ridgeline, with Captain Sholly's Company B flanking to the south. Sands had his company in a 4-platoon column and, wanting more strength forward as the vegetation closed in, ordered his 1st platoon to move up abreast of the 2nd platoon in the lead. Around 7:30 in the morning, the 1st platoon slid out of the column and began moving up on the left. It had gone perhaps 50 to 100 yards when the jungle in front of it erupted. The enemy fire came from prepared positions along the ridgeline, to the front and to the left of Company A, and it fell first and hardest on the 2 lead platoons. They were caught in what appeared to be a deliberately sighted ambush, and the effect was immediate and devastating. By the recollection of one of the company's medics, the 2 lead platoons lost on the order of 27 killed and 45 wounded within the first 4 or 5 minutes. Whether or not those figures are exact, they capture the speed of the thing. This was not a firefight that built. It arrived all at once. North Vietnamese troops began working around the flanks of the pinned-down platoons, trying to encircle the entire company. Sands, moving with his command group behind the 2nd platoon, called for artillery and tried to pull together a defensive perimeter. He got Company B on the radio and told Sholly plainly that his company was taking heavy casualties and did not know how long it could hold. Moments later, while he was adjusting artillery fire, a rocket-propelled grenade struck the command group and killed him. Command of Company A passed on the spot to First Sergeant David McNerney. What McNerney did over the next several hours is the reason this battle is remembered by name. He took a company that had lost its commander and much of its 2 lead platoons and steadied it. He adjusted artillery fire to within about 20 meters of his own positions, close enough that the shrapnel cut down vegetation and men on both sides without distinction, because that was the range required to keep the enemy from overrunning what was left. When a resupply helicopter needed a visual reference to find the company in the canopy, McNerney climbed a tall tree under fire and tied a bright orange identification panel to the highest branch he could reach, marking the position for the pilot. He had already been knocked down and injured by an enemy grenade earlier that morning. He climbed anyway. Throughout the day he moved among the wounded, encouraged the survivors, and at one point helped clear a landing zone so the casualties could be lifted out. While Company A fought to keep from being encircled, Company B was fighting its own battle to reach it. Scholly had heard the firing and, unable to raise Sands by radio, had already put his 4 platoons online and turned toward the sound of the guns before Lee's order to assist even reached him. As Company B pushed through the underbrush, a pair of machine guns tore into its 4th platoon on the left flank, pinning it in a bamboo field. The North Vietnamese, later identified as a battalion of the 95B Regiment, had done something disciplined and deliberate. They had placed a blocking force squarely between the 2 American companies to keep them from linking up, so that each could be dealt with separately. Scholly tried to flank the blocking force, sending his 2nd platoon to the right. The platoon rushed forward and dropped into a dry creek bed about 5 feet wide and 4 feet deep, which offered a little cover and was immediately met by heavy automatic weapons fire from enemy soldiers dug in on the far bank. The fight there settled into a costly, close-range exchange that neither side could quickly win. Stalled on the flanks and unable to see through the brush and bamboo, Scholly pulled his command post back and called on everything the supporting arms could give him. He brought in 105mm and 155mm artillery, fighter bombers, and flights of propeller-driven Sky Raiders loaded with napalm, pounding the blocking force until his company could move again. The cumulative weight of American firepower is what finally broke the engagement. Gunships and fighter bombers hammered the positions around Company A. Artillery fell steadily, blind through the canopy, guided by men who could hear the rounds better than they could see them. By early afternoon, the enemy blocking force had been battered enough that Company B could resume its advance to the west-northwest, carrying its dead and wounded with it. The North Vietnamese fought to a standstill by Company A and worked over from the air and by the guns, began to withdraw from the battlefield. The 2 companies finally linked up later that afternoon. Scholly, taking command of both, learned from McNerney that Sands was dead, and the survivors spent the rest of the daylight digging a perimeter large enough for 2 companies and lifting out the casualties. Fought for the most part at close range, the battle in the Plei Doc cost the 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry 27 killed and 48 wounded. Company A absorbed the great majority of that loss, including 22 dead. The missing reconnaissance patrol, the men the whole operation had been mounted to recover, was never found. What happened next illustrates a different kind of problem, one that had nothing to do with terrain or the enemy. That evening, around 11 o'clock, General Pears asked Adamson for an enemy body count. Adamson, by his own later account, had no idea. The reply he got was that Saigon wanted a number. A second call from the field force commander asked the same thing. Pressed for a figure he did not have, Adamson gave one. He said 150. The next day, when his men actually counted, they found about 45 bodies, and the earlier figure was withdrawn and replaced. Officially, the division reported 136 enemy killed. The true number was almost certainly higher than 45, given the North Vietnamese practice of removing their dead. But the episode is revealing regardless of where the real figure lay. A metric intended to measure progress had instead been produced on demand, worked backward from a requirement rather than forward from the ground. It is a pattern that would recur across the war, and it did not originate with the men who fought this battle. There is a further wrinkle worth noting. because it shows how thoroughly the enemy had absorbed the tactical realities of fighting the American army. The North Vietnamese battalion did not simply ambush Company A and hope for the best. It positioned a separate blocking force between the two American companies, a decision that reflected a clear understanding of how the Americans would respond to contact. They knew a stricken company would call for help, and they knew help would come, and they arranged the battlefield so that the relief could be held off while the isolated company was worked over. This was not the improvisation of a force stumbling into a fight. It was the deliberate shaping of an engagement by a side that had studied its opponent and understood that the American advantage in firepower could be blunted, at least temporarily, by keeping American units apart and fighting them at ranges so close that artillery and airstrikes endangered friend and foe alike. The 20-meter artillery adjustments that saved Company A are the clearest evidence of how well that calculation worked. American firepower still prevailed, but only by being brought down almost on top of the men it was meant to protect. The valor displayed on March 22nd was recognized at the highest level the Army offers. First Sergeant David McNerney received the Medal of Honor for his actions that day. The citation captured what the survivors already knew, that he had taken command of a leaderless and badly hurt company, directed its defense with artillery adjusted dangerously close to his own men, exposed himself repeatedly to enemy fire to organize the perimeter and mark the position for resupply, and refused evacuation to remain with the company until a relief force arrived and a new commander could take over. He was decorated at a White House ceremony in September 1968. One of the men he pulled through the fight put it simply afterward, crediting McNerney's bravery with getting them out, though McNerney himself would have been the first to insist that the young rifleman holding the line had earned as much of the credit as he had. The nation's second highest decoration for valor, the Distinguished Service Cross, and its third highest, the Silver Star, are the awards that most often attach to actions like those the rest of the battalion fought through that day. The platoon leaders who kept their people firing while encircled, the machine gunners of the 3rd Platoon who slowed the enemy advance by shooting from the hip, the medics who ran toward the calls of wounded men through fire that was cutting down everyone around them. The Army does not always publish a tidy accounting of every such award tied to a single engagement, and the historical record of this fight foregrounds the Medal of Honor above the rest. What can be said with confidence is that a company does not survive being cut in half in the opening minutes of an ambush on the strength of one man alone. It survives because enough individuals, at enough points along a collapsing line, each did something that the situation did not require them to survive. Measured against its own objectives, the mission of March 22nd failed. The reconnaissance patrol was never recovered, and the cost of trying was a rifle company gutted in a matter of minutes. Measured against the larger logic of Operation Sam Houston, the picture is more ambiguous. The operation as a whole did keep the North Vietnamese from settling comfortably into the Plei trap, and it tied down enemy regiments through the height of the dry season, denying them the freedom to strike more vulnerable targets elsewhere. But it did so at a price the enemy was increasingly able to control. Time and again through this operation, North Vietnamese units chose when and where to fight, struck hard at close range, and then withdrew across a border the Americans could not cross, taking their dead with them and leaving their opponents to tally an uncertain body count for headquarters. The battle in the Plei Doc was a concentrated version of that whole dynamic, a lost patrol drawing a relief force onto ground the enemy had already prepared. The men of the 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry fought their way out of it through discipline, firepower, and individual courage, none of which could change the fact that they had been maneuvered into it in the first place.